I finally did it. I now own every US released, officially licensed Nintendo game. Now, of course, there are a lot of asterisks that come with that statement, and there's a 30+ year story of how I got here. One of the questions I get asked the most is, do you own Stadium Events, the rarest and most expensive Nintendo game? And I do not. I'm twisting the definition of officially released to where I don't need to own Stadium Events. The game was created by Bandai and released officially by Nintendo, but shortly after its release, Nintendo bought the rights to the game. They pulled it from store shelves, they rebranded it, and re-released it as World Class Track Meet. Now, I do own World Class Track Meet, both as a standalone cartridge and as a multi-game cartridge. Now, Stadium Events commands really high prices due to it having very few copies left out in circulation. So even if I ran across a copy, I probably would not be able to afford it. It costs as much or more than a new car. So a lot of collectors consider Stadium Events to be a variant of World Class Track Meet. Now, speaking of variants, I'm also excluding variants from my collection. An example would be a game like Metroid, Blades of Steel, or The Untouchables that have different labels, but the game is identical. Now, in the case of those games, I do own the variants, as well as a few others, but there are other games that have very minor label differences, and I do not own all of those. Another example of a variant is a game that comes in a 3-screw and 5-screw variety. Now, initially, all original Nintendo games were held together with 5 screws, and at some point a few years after the NES came out, a change was made, and the top 2 screws were replaced with tabs. Now, while that may seem insignificant, that means that each of the millions of games that were manufactured after that change used 40% less screws, and probably saved Nintendo thousands upon thousands of dollars in manufacturing cost. I'm not even sure that there is an official list of all the games that come in both 3 and 5 screw variants, so it would be hard to add all of those to my collection, and much like Stadium Events, some of those get very expensive. And there are also a few non-United States released games like The Lion King, Aladdin, and Mr. Gimmick that I do not own because they weren't released in America. And lastly, I do not own all of the unlicensed games. Now, an unlicensed game is a game that comes in a black or blue or gold or other shaped or colored cartridge, and it was not officially licensed by Nintendo. I have a lot of them. I need less than 20 to have all of the unlicensed games as well, but much like Stadium Events, a few of them are really hard to find, and the prices get into the thousands of dollars. As an example, there are 3 unlicensed Nintendo games that feature nudity, not including the officially licensed River City Ransom. Those games are called Bubble Bath Babes, Hot Sluts, and Peekaboo Poker. Each of those cost over $3,000, so they will remain not in my collection. But anyway, now that I've gotten all of the asterisks out of the way, I wanted to talk a little bit about my NES collecting journey and talk about some of the most interesting stories of how I acquired games. Ever since the very first time I played Super Mario Bros. With my cousin Jamie back in 1987, I was hooked on Nintendo. I really wanted to play Duck Hunt, but he would not let me and told me Super Mario Bros. Was a much better game. Now, I still remember the feeling of playing it for the very first time, and as nerdy as it sounds, there have been very few moments in my entire life that have given me that same sense of wonder. So after playing Super Mario Bros. For the first time, I would use any opportunity I could to play Nintendo. If I was at a friend's house or at a department store or anywhere there was a game, I was probably there playing it. One of the strangest ways that I got to play a game before I owned a Nintendo of my own was I was again hanging out with my cousin Jamie, and we found out that one of his neighbors owned Double Dragon. His mom would not let us come in their house to play the game. So we did the next best thing. We stood outside of his bedroom window. He strung the controller cord across the room, handed it out the window, and there we stood in his backyard playing Double Dragon. Christmas of 1988, my brother and I finally got our very own Nintendo. And as I still play it semi-regularly, I would say it is hands down the most used Christmas gift that I ever received in my entire life. Now, my brother and I didn't have a whole lot of Nintendo games, so it was always a treat to visit a video store and rent a game that we'd heard so much about from either friends or from Nintendo Power magazine. A couple of years after I finally got my Nintendo, I was hanging out with my cousin Jamie again, and we were invited down the street to one of his friends' house to play Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Now, my cousin bragged how I could beat King Hippo, and I was handed the controller to show off to these older kids who were almost twice my age. They all cheered me on, and then I got knocked out, and I lost the fight, embarrassing both myself and my cousin Jamie, who had vouched for me. As I said a second ago, we didn't have a whole lot of Nintendo games growing up before I started collecting. We had the 3 Super Mario Brothers games, and we had both the Zeldas, we had Rad Racer, and we had Bandai Golf Challenge Pebble Beach that my golf-obsessed grandfather bought for us since he couldn't play the real Pebble Beach golf course. Much like other kids in our town, we also had a couple of games that nobody else seemed to have. I suspect it's one of those deals where mom was out shopping for a last-minute Christmas or birthday gift and bought some clearance game that just hadn't sold well. Now for us, those games were Fester's Quest, featuring Uncle Fester from the Addams Family, and the boat combat game Cobra Triangle. Now one day my aunt and her boyfriend came over with the son of a friend of theirs who was about my age, and he also owned Cobra Triangle, and that bonded us since no one else we knew owned that game. We spent all day playing Cobra Triangle and trading tips and tricks about how to beat each level. Now of course these tips and tricks were learned through trial and error because the internet didn't exist back then, and the internet has really ruined interactions as every tip and trick is available to everyone all the time. I miss those word of mouth days. As a related pre-internet side story, I have a memory in the first grade of witnessing a 5th grader pin another 5th grader to the wall during school recess. He had the kid's shirt bunched up in his fist like this, and he was slamming him into the wall. He was saying, "Give me the code to get to Mike Tyson on Punch Out!" The internet would have prevented this fight, but I was so traumatized by this interaction that I made sure to memorize that code to get to Mike Tyson in case I was ever in that same situation. Of course, I was never in that situation, but I still remember that code, and I still remember reciting it to the woman working at the video store when I first rented Punch Out. So in middle school, when everyone had moved on to Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, and Sony PlayStation, I decided to use the opportunity to get as many original Nintendo games as I could. And most people were just giving them away, so it wasn't that hard. But sometimes I'd ask, "Hey, do you have any old Nintendo games you don't play anymore? I would love to take them off your hands." They're like, "Oh, we threw those Nintendo tapes away because we didn't have any use for them anymore." Anyway, by the time high school rolled around, I had about 80 games, which I think was as many, maybe a little bit more than the character Lucas had in The Wizard. And I always thought that was like a really cool thing that it had more games than Lucas, the gaming wizard from The Wizard. Anyway, by the end of high school, I had about 300 games. Most of them I got completely for free. So in 1996, I was in high school, and I made this cringy video that I had planned to show on the school's morning announcements, asking every kid in school for their NES games.
Would you like to be in the Guinness Book of World Records? Wouldn't we all? Well, if you help me with my quest, you will be in the Guinness Book of World Records. All you need to do is donate your 8-bit Nintendo cartridges. Right now we have 84 different games, and by the end of the year hope to have about 150. One day we will have the largest Nintendo game collection in the world, and this will earn us our place on the Guinness Book of World Records. Any games you donate will be in the Guinness Book of World Records also, and your name for donating them to us. If you have any games that you would like to donate, please contact Matt. Thank you. Have a nice day.
This is the first time this video has ever been shown to anybody, and I don't know what I was thinking. Why would owning every NES game get me into the Guinness Book of World Records? And if it did, why would the entry in the book list everyone who gave me a game? At best, it would have been a 2-sentence blurb. Also, I don't think anybody really cared about getting in the Guinness Book of World Records except for me, so it wasn't even an incentive for people to give me their games. But I ended up chickening out, and I never played that tape in front of the school because, you know, people might have thought I was a nerd. So in 1997, I decided to create a website showcasing my Nintendo collection, as well as people from all around the world's collections. I was by no means a programmer, and this was the early days of web development, so it was a very basic web page. Even so, I regularly got emails from people around the world and would talk to people on AOL Instant Messenger about their collections. I didn't know how to make a GIF, so I enlisted the help of a friend to make one for me of all of the Mega Man 1 bosses that just flipped through and rotated through each of the bosses. I added this to my webpage, and then over the next decade, pretty much every Nintendo webpage on the internet had that GIF on it. Somebody stole it and it spread like wildfire. So in 1999, I had a friend dare me to do something way nerdier than playing that video to the school, and I did it. For the next 2 years, I drove the Nintendo Mobile, a 1991 Pontiac Bonneville with the Nintendo logo plastered across the windshield. Now, even if you didn't know me personally, I guarantee everyone in my small town knew my car. So my senior year of high school, I was chosen with about a dozen other kids at my school to showcase my interest and have a professional photo shoot done that would be on display at the mall. Some kids wore their sports uniforms, others were playing musical instruments or acting out some dramatic scene from a play. I showcased my NES collection. And between this photo, the website, and the sticker on my car, I'm not sure why I chickened taking out playing that video to the school. In fact, I actually have that picture hung up in my game room right over there. I could never find the perfect shelf to hold my games, so I built one myself. Now, the first shelf that I built was a tank, and I figured I would never fill it up. I also measured it wrong, and the bottom shelf was not the same size as the rest of the shelves, and that always bugged me. So eventually we moved, and our new house had a lot more space. So I decided to build a bigger shelf, and I shot a nail right through my thumb in the process. Now, eventually it became obvious that I was going to outgrow this shelf as well. So I did some math and realized that if I used 1x6 lumber instead of 2x6 lumber, I could get 2 extra rows of shelves in the same space, and that would be enough to fit every game. And that's the shelf that you see here. A few months after I completed this shelf, we decided to redo the floors in our basement, which meant I had to move the shelf. Everything was going fine until I decided to lay the shelf down on the floor. The whole back fell out of the shelf. Games went everywhere. This picture doesn't really do it justice. When I lifted it back up, everything just slid out all over the floor, and it took me days to get everything back in order and organized. Luckily, nothing broke. I ended up screwing the back on the shelf where before it had been nailed, so if I ever have to move the shelf again, it's gonna hold. Now, I've gone through ebbs and flows of collecting over the years, but I would always stop at local game stores if I was traveling to try to add to my collection and slowly chipping away at the ultimate goal of owning every original NES game. I've bought games stores all across the country, from Augusta, Maine, where I heard a record scratch when I walked in and started talking because my thick southern accent was something they'd never heard before. I've also bought games in Anchorage, Alaska, which of every store in the country I've been to had the biggest selection of rare games, and I was not expecting that. I've even made my wife buy me games when she's on a girls trip somewhere. She bought me some Sesame Street games in Roswell, New Mexico. Pretty much all of our family photos over the years when we're on vacation involve me looking at games in game stores. So finally, I would like to share a few stories from my collecting journey that have kind of stuck out to me over the years. And I'm going to start it off with my biggest gaming regret. It's 2008, and I was laid off from my job, and I was tightening my belt as much as possible, trying to find any way I could to make money. And I decided that even though I could never sell my NES games, realistically, I was never going to own all of the boxes and the manuals and the accessories. So I ended up selling all of the non-gaming Nintendo stuff that I had to a guy on Craigslist for $50. Now, it was probably 100 items, included complete and box Rockin' Cats, which is worth a couple of $100 today, a mint box and manual for the game Contra Force, and dozens of other rare items. Now, once I found a job, I emailed this guy back and I offered to buy everything back for market value. And of course, he never responded. So these are the boxes that I have now, but I probably had 3 times this many that I sold for nothing, basically. One time in high school, I was out just tootling around town, and I went into a laundromat for some reason, I don't know why. And the guy working the counter, he just was randomly selling all 4 Dragon Warrior games for $2 each. Back then, you never knew where you were going to find a game. So back in about 2012, 2013-ish, Zombie Nation sat on the shelf of a local game store that sold DVDs and CDs and video games, and I just couldn't justify paying the insanely high price for it. So I decided to ask for a gift certificate to the store for my birthday so I could spend someone else's money on the game. I got the certificate, I went in the store, and I bought Zombie Nation for the insanely high price of $49.99. The current value of the game is a lot more than that. So I heard about a new video game store that sold retro games one town over for me. This was a very strange store. They did sell video games, but they also rented U-Hauls, and they sold plastic horse toys, and it was a frozen yogurt shop. Now, the first time I walked in, on the back wall, I saw a painting that a guy I used to work with at Sears in college had painted. Now, I hadn't spoken to him in quite a while, but I reached out to him and we rekindled our friendship. Now, I've lost count of how many game nights we've had since then and how many trips we've made all over the state of Kentucky looking for video games. I constantly talked about how awesome that painting was in the game store, so my wife secretly commissioned a custom painting from him for my 30th birthday. Over 10 years later, it is still the centerpiece of my game room, and it would be the first thing I grabbed if the house caught on fire. My mom is an avid sewer, and she made me an awesome Nintendo controller pillow as well as a throw blanket. And my good friend Jason, another artist, has drawn all kinds of custom Nintendo-themed artwork that I have hung up all over the game room. One Saturday, I drove to a flea market about an hour away from here. The first booth I stop at, the guy's yelling, "I got Nintendo stuff. All the Mario games is $25. Everything else is only $5. I walk up to the counter and notice that he had a copy of the pretty rare RC Pro-Am 2, which at the time was worth about $80. I was glad to pay $5 for that game. Now, just a couple of years ago, when I was winding down my collecting and just needed some of those really rare items, a friend of mine mentioned that he had a copy of Kid Clown that he was wanting to sell, and he was needing needing a lawnmower, and I just so happened to have a riding lawnmower that I didn't need, so we traded. Now, strangely, this is not the only time that I've sold or traded Nintendo stuff for a lawnmower. In 2015, my wife and I were in Cincinnati, Ohio, about 2 hours from our house. We stopped to eat at a mall, and I noticed a game store with a sign in the window that said, "We have Little Samson." I went in and I spoke to the owner, who said not only did he have Little Samson, but he also had the instruction manual. He gave me the price he wanted for both the game and the manual, and it was more than I'd ever paid for anything video game related in my life. But it was a lot less than the market value. I couldn't decide if I wanted to buy the game, so he says, "Oh, I also have Flintstones at Dino Peak, which is also a top 5 rare Nintendo game," and he wanted less than half of the market value for that one. So I could not pass up this deal. I agreed to buy both games, and he says, "Well, I don't have them here in the store. They're at home in my safe. You need to come back tomorrow." So after I agreed to buy both Little Samson and Flintstones Surprise at Dino Peak, he then offered to sell me his entire game store so he could retire. He wasn't joking, but I did not buy the store. So unfortunately, he did not have the games at the store. He had them at home in his safe, which meant I had to drive back up 2 hours from home the next day to pick up these games. Except he wasn't at the store the next day. He was at a flea market another 30 minutes north. It was basically a 5-hour trip to buy these games, but the deal was too good to pass up. So I made the long drive, purchased the games. I then shortly after sold the manual to Little Samson and used the money I got from that to purchase an electric lawnmower. And finally, the strangest way that I ever got a game for my collection, Mighty Final Fight. I had to jump through so many hoops to get this game. My friend Aaron owned the game as a kid, along with the manual, and he said he wouldn't sell it to me unless it was the very last game that I needed for my collection. Well, a couple of years later, I lucked into someone I know buying a building that had previously been a video store, and she let me raid the store and take basically anything I wanted for next to nothing. I loaded up on a whole lot of horror movie DVDs, and I contacted Aaron, who's a huge horror movie fan, and I said, "Hey, would you trade this Mighty Final Fight for all of these DVDs?" And he said he would, but he wanted to make it a little bit harder for me to get this game. So he says, "I also want a 6-pack of mishaps beer," the beer brewed by the band Hanson, who became famous in the late 90s for their song Bop. Well, while that seems like a really random request, Hanson has played a very large part in my life, and without that band, I would never have met my wife, but that is a story for a different day. At the time, you could only get that beer near the band's hometown of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Well, my wife had a friend who regularly traveled to see the band tour, and she happened to be in Tulsa around that time, and she picked up a 6-pack of the beer and brought it to us when she came back home. I have the beer and I have the DVDs. Aaron's final request was that he come over and watch me beat the game. I tried and tried, but no matter what, I just could not beat it. I was having an off night. But luckily for me, he gave in, and the DVDs and the mishaps beer were enough. I don't imagine that I'll ever be done with the hobby. I'm now trying to beat and review every game on the system. I'm 10 years into that journey, and I haven't even beaten 200 games yet, so I doubt I'm ever going to finish. But as for collecting, I'm not sure what's next. Maybe I'll do some upgrades and replace some games in my collection that have bad labels. Maybe I'll start trying to get boxes and manuals again, or maybe I'll go for all the Nintendo 64 games, which I have down here, and I already own about 75% of them, so maybe that wouldn't be too bad to do. But to all the people who have helped me out on my collecting journey over the past 30 years, I want to let you know that I could not have done this without you. Thank you so much.